This is a paid advertisement from BetterHelp. Let's pause and take a moment to talk about something very important. Life has its pressures for everyone, and we often carry the immense weight of expectation to never show weakness, to hide our true feelings, and believe that asking for support somehow makes us less of a person. But bottling things up isn't the answer. It can often lead to feeling down, burnout, or other unhealthy habits. We want to normalize the idea that it's okay to struggle. Real strength actually comes from opening up about what you are carrying and doing something about it so that you can be at your best for yourself and everyone in your life. If you're feeling the weight of the world, or even if things just feel a bit off, I can't stress enough the value of talking to someone. It could be a friend, a loved one, or a therapist. We here at This Week Explained believe that therapy can be incredibly valuable. Whether you've been in therapy personally or not, the broader benefits are clear. It's so helpful for learning positive coping skills, understanding how to set healthy boundaries, and it really empowers you to be the best version of yourself. And it's so important to remember that therapy isn't just for those who've experienced combat or major trauma. It's a tool for anyone looking to improve their mental well-being and navigate life's challenges. That's why we're thrilled to talk about BetterHelp. With over 5,000 therapists in the UK, BetterHelp is the world's largest online therapy platform, having served over 5 million people globally. And it clearly resonates with users, boasting an App Store rating of 4.9 out of 5 stars based on over 1.7 million client reviews. It's also incredibly convenient. You can connect with a therapist at the click of a button, helping you fit therapy into your busy schedule. And you can even switch therapists at any time if you feel it's not the right fit. And here's something special for our listeners. As the largest online therapy provider in the world, BetterHelp is offering our listeners 10% off their first month. What are you waiting for? Talk it out with BetterHelp. Once again, our listeners get 10% off their first month by going to betterhelp.com/thisweek. That's BetterHelp.com/thisweek. Tired of feeling overwhelmed by the headlines? Want to truly understand the why behind the global chaos? Then you are in the right place. Welcome to This Week Explained, your weekly deep dive into the most complex and impactful stories shaping our world. I'm Tiana, and joining me as always is Kervin. Before we jump into the crucial developments of the week, a quick favor. If you want to ensure you never miss an episode, make sure you're following or subscribed on your podcast platform. It literally takes 2 seconds and keeps you instantly updated. And if you are getting value from what we are doing here, a simple rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify helps us reach more curious minds like yours. And don't forget the new interactive comments on Spotify. It's a fantastic way to engage directly with the show and other listeners, extending the conversation beyond the broadcast. You can also find more fantastic podcasts like ours by visiting leonmedianetwork.com, part of the awesome Leon Media Network. This week, it's all about shifting power. In Ukraine, a week of frantic, high-stakes diplomacy could be redrawing the political map of the conflict. In Gaza, the end of war with Israel has ignited a brutal internal battle for control, while a generational wave of change is cresting in Africa. Meanwhile, a new and potentially volatile conflict is brewing in the Americas. Old wars, new battles, and a world in flux. So let's start in Ukraine. This week, it has been a remarkably busy week of high-stakes diplomacy centered on the war in Ukraine. And we've seen a flurry of activity between Washington, Kyiv, and Moscow that feels like it could be a pivotal moment.
It certainly feels that way. In the span of 48 hours, or just about 48 hours, we had President Trump hold a lengthy phone call with President Putin, followed immediately by a White House visit from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And out of all of that, we now have a new summit on the calendar.
I know a lot of people around here have not been too thrilled about the traffic situation in D.C. because of Zelensky's visit. A lot of roads have been at a complete standstill. I've seen a lot of complaints about that, which I guess is typical for diplomatic visits.
Yeah, I know. I've seen that. It's very typical for that. But, you know, we've got the government.
They closed the Key Bridge, I think.
Yeah. But we've also got the government shutdown. I did see a great meme that said there's way too much traffic for the government to be shut down in D.C.
I saw one that said, I saw one that said the traffic isn't furloughed enough for a government shutdown.
That's it. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, we're gonna say. I mean, we're basically saying the same thing, but a little differently.
Yeah.
So, obviously, there is a lot to unpack here. So, let's start with President Zelensky's visit on Friday. He came to Washington with a very, very clear objective. What was he seeking, and what did he leave with?
Well, look, his primary goal was to secure a commitment for those long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles. We talked about that last week very briefly. Now, Ukraine believes these weapons would be a game changer that would allow them to strike deep into Russian territory and severely damage the infrastructure that supports Russia's war effort. But from all public indications, he did come away empty-handed on that specific request. President Trump was very non-committal.
Once again, probably using it as a bargaining chip. But we spoke last week about the conflicting reporting out of the Trump administration. So why is there hesitation from the White House? Like I said, I think he's using it as a bargaining chip so it can be another conflict that he can claim he ended entirely by himself without any help from anyone else.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And there are two main reasons for this. First is the concern over escalation. That is something that they are concerned about. Supplying a weapon that can reach Moscow is a significant step. But second, President Trump did mention a more practical issue. He said that the United States cannot afford to deplete its own stockpiles of these crucial munitions. I would put a third reason on here, not something that they're publicly stating, but something that I know is going on behind the scenes, and it's exactly what you said, Tiana. It's using this as a bargaining chip. The only reason we're getting to this summit between Putin and Trump, which we'll talk about pretty soon on the podcast, the only reason this came about is because of that threat to provide Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine in order to fire on locations within Moscow. So you can see the ramifications of that, or the repercussions that are coming out of that. Now, what I will say is that the door was not entirely closed on the Tomahawk missiles, but as of right now, it is certainly not. The doors are not opened to that right now.
Well, after the meeting, we all saw President Zelensky's public remarks. For our audience, could you analyze the tone he adopted in that response? Like, what does the strength of his language tell us about Ukraine's current assessment of its own military position and its leverage in negotiations?
I think he understood the position that the U.S. had in this. When he was asked by reporters if he was optimistic about receiving the missiles, he simply said, "I am realistic." I think that's a smart quote from him. He did, however, float an interesting proposal of Ukraine providing thousands of its own drones to the U.S. in a potential swap. I would say it's a pretty creative piece of diplomacy. He's using Trump's transactional diplomacy, trying to use that in Zelensky's favor. He is determined to keep that conversation alive.
It is also worth noting that the tone of this meeting was reportedly very cordial, a significant change from that meeting back in February that turned into a public shouting match.
Yeah, and I think you've identified a very important detail here. The personal dynamics between these leaders actually do matter within these diplomatic conversations. So a calm, professional working lunch suggests that the lines of communication are functional, even if there's no agreement on those very, very difficult topics.
So, as this meeting with Zelensky was happening, it was completely overshadowed by the news that broke the day before. President Trump had a 2-hour call with Vladimir Putin, and they have agreed to meet again. So, what do we know about this planned summit?
Well, the first thing is that it's planned to be held in Budapest, Hungary, which makes sense with Putin's warrant from the ICC. Now, according to President Trump, it will happen very quickly within the next 2 weeks or so. And the stated aim, in his words, is to bring the inglorious war between Russia and Ukraine to an end. The ninth war that Trump has apparently stopped since he started his second administration. Thus follows their last summit in Alaska, which happened a couple of months ago, which we all remember that did not produce any tangible breakthroughs in the war, probably caused more harm than good in that respect.
So we have a Ukrainian president asking for weapons that could escalate the war, and a U.S. president simultaneously planning a peace summit with the Kremlin. This brings us back to the Tomahawks, which feel less like a weapon system right now and more like a political tool.
Yeah, spot on once again. That's exactly how they're being used right now. President Trump seems to be employing the threat of providing these missiles as leverage. He's essentially confirmed this. He said that the threat itself is actually good for negotiations. So, as I said, he's created an ultimatum for Putin. Putin actually came out right after that and accepted the phone call, now accepting the summit. And so Trump is telling Putin, you either come to the table for serious, tangible peace talks, or your adversary, Ukraine, gets weapons that can actually strike at the heart of your country.
But how is Moscow responding to this threat? Because we know earlier in the conflict, Putin, waived nuclear weapons. Oh, he said, if anybody from the West tries to help Ukraine, we have every right to defend ourselves with nuclear weapons. So what are they saying about this?
Well, it looks like they're taking it very seriously. I think they see their depleted military. I think that Putin understands now that even the threat of a nuclear attack is not going to do well. He does not see a way forward. And I think the longer this goes, remember, we talked about last year, he said that by 2026 or the spring of 2026, he wanted this war, this special military operation to be done. We're closing in on that. So he needs an off-ramp here. And he might have found one with these peace talks that could happen during this summit. But like I said, the Kremlin is very concerned about this. I know during the phone call between Trump and Putin reportedly told President Trump that providing the missiles would actually not change the outcome on the battlefield, but it would severely harm the chances for a peaceful resolution. So the threat is having the intended effect of getting the full attention of the Kremlin.
So let's talk about the location for this summit. You kind of hinted at this, but Budapest is a very specific and symbolic choice. Why Hungary?
Yeah, I think the choice of venue is strategically brilliant for this situation. First, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, he is one of the few European leaders who maintain friendly relations with both Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. So he can position himself as this honest broker, but he also gets this prestige of hosting a major peace summit.
But you alluded to a more significant practical reason. So can you explain what you were talking about with the ICC?
Yeah, for sure. And this is a critical piece. As we all know, the International Criminal Court has an active arrest warrant out for Vladimir Putin for alleged war crimes. Most European nations are signatories of the ICC. That means if Putin would step foot in their country, they would be obligated to arrest him. Now, Hungary, however, is withdrawing from the ICC, and this move effectively nullifies the warrant within their borders. It's making it one of the few places in the European Union where Putin can travel freely for meetings such as this.
With all of this happening at the highest levels, what is the feeling among the people actually affected by this war?
I think the reactions are quite divided. You probably expect that. In Russia, reports suggest a mix of cautious hope, but also deep-seated skepticism. Some citizens believe President Trump's efforts might bear fruit, but perhaps on smaller issues like prisoner exchanges, not a full peace deal or ceasefire. Others feel that previous meetings have yielded nothing, so this one's going to yield nothing. I think there is this palpable weariness with the war in Russia.
And in Ukraine?
Yet the Ukrainians seem far less hopeful. There's a general sense that these talks are unproductive, and a deep distrust on President Trump's motives in this. I saw a quote from a medic, Ukrainian army medic, was quoted as saying that Trump is not for Ukraine. Yet, underneath that skepticism, there is still a resolute belief in their fight and an expectation that the American people are going to continue to support Ukraine in their efforts for peace and for pushing back against an adversary like Russia. That's regardless of all of the diplomatic maneuvering that's happened. So a complex mix of despair, yet determination.
So we're left with this incredibly tense and fluid situation. We have a U.S. president trying to mediate an end to a brutal war, using the threat of powerful weapons as his primary leverage. So in the coming weeks, what are the key signposts we should be watching for?
Yeah, I think there are three things to watch here. First, the preparatory meetings. That's going to be between Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He's meeting his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, this coming week. The outcome and tone of that meeting, that's going to set the stage for the leaders' summit between Putin and Trump. Now, second, we need to watch the rhetoric on the Tomahawk missiles. Do the threats continue? Does the language soften as a concession to get Putin to the table? And then third and finally, it'll be the summit itself when that happens. Are we going to see a genuine diplomatic opening, or is this just going to be another move on a very crowded 4D chessboard?
It is a moment of both great risk and potential opportunity, so we will certainly be following it closely. Keep an eye on our social media pages as Curvin continues to provide assessments to these global events. Now, I want to shift focus to the Middle East, and for the first time in over 2 years, we are not opening this show by discussing an active war in Gaza. A ceasefire, brokered last week, is holding for now. The quiet of the battles between Hamas and the IDF has been replaced by a much more complicated and in many ways more uncertain sound. I am, of course, talking about the new chapter for Gaza where it may not be war, but it is certainly not a simple peace. So let's start with the deal itself. It feels incredibly fragile, held together by a thread. What are the biggest points of friction right now that could cause it all to unravel?
Look, the most immediate and emotionally charged issue is the return of the dead hostages. Prime Minister Netanyahu is under immense domestic pressure, and he has stated that he is determined to secure the return of the 19 bodies that remain in Gaza. He's also threatened to restrict aid and even resume military action if they are not handed over.
And what is Hamas's position? Are they actually the ones holding up this part of the agreement?
Not necessarily. Their narrative is one of logistics, not necessarily refusal. They claim they are unable to access the remaining bodies. They blame the level of destruction. They allege that Israel is not permitting the heavy machinery needed for the search of those bodies. Hamas insists they are committed to the ceasefire. They've reportedly even passed coordinates of known locations to mediators. So it's a very tense situation. That's because while Israel sees this as a potential breach, the United States has publicly downplayed that suggestion. They want to keep the ceasefire active, and they state that Hamas appears to be acting in good faith in this regard.
So, with the Israeli military gone, one war has ended, only for another to ignite. You've described it as a total power vacuum. So paint a picture for us. What does that brutal struggle for control actually look like on the ground right now?
And we've talked about power vacuums in Syria and other places, and this vacuum didn't stay empty that long. For years, aid groups used the sanitized phrase of de facto authority for Hamas within Gaza. Now, Hamas is dropping the de facto and using brute force to make their authority absolute. Their fighters at this moment are systematically hunting down collaborators and political rivals in a campaign to eliminate any challenge to their power. But beneath that, there's a second layer of chaos that's happening. There's no police. There's no civil administration. So the streets are a free-for-all. We're seeing powerful clans settling old blood feuds out in the open. You've got armed gangs carving out their own territory. And then you've got desperate people looting whatever resources are left just to survive. So it's not just a power vacuum. This is a war of all against all in Gaza.
So Hamas is positioning itself as the solution to the chaos?
Yeah, in a way, they are really attempting to reestablish a monopoly on violence. And their message is clear. We are the only ones who can bring law and order to Gaza. Look, their methods, as typical, very brutal. We've seen reports of skirmishes, shootings, very public execution of men accused of being collaborators with the IDF. They are projecting an image of terrifying strength, believing they can deter rivals and criminals, not through a justice system, which really doesn't exist right now in Gaza, but through sheer brute force.
So how is that being received by the civilian population there? A population that is, as the reports say, hungry, weak, and severely traumatized.
Yeah, look, it is deeply divided. That may come as a surprise to some people. There are many who are, of course, appalled by the actions of Hamas. They see it as correcting one crime with another, executions without trial. But you also have Palestinians who are just so desperate for an end to the anarchy and crime that they actually openly support these measures. For some, the rough justice of Hamas is preferable to the last 2 years of war.
Okay, so let's bring in the international angle because the United States is obviously watching this very closely. President Trump's comments have been confusing, to say the least.
Yeah, they've been very contradictory. So early last week, he seemed to downplay the violence. He was suggesting Hamas was just taking out some bad gangs and that it really didn't bother him much what was going on in Gaza. But then a few days after that, he posted a very stark warning. He said, if Hamas continues to kill people, we will have no choice. This is a quote. I guess I should quote this from Trump. Quote, we will have no choice but to go in and kill them, end quote.
Did he mean American forces?
That's a great question. He did clarify that it would not be American soldiers, but that, quote, people very close, very nearby, end quote, would do it under our auspices, under America's auspices. This signals, I think, a very complicated American position. Look, Trump wants the ceasefire to hold. This is something he has promoted, and he's been very proud of. Peace in the Middle East, as he called it. So he really cannot tolerate the optics of Hamas running death squads in the streets. So the U.S. is drawing a line, however blurry, on what kind of internal policing is acceptable.
And what about Israel's role in creating this dynamic? We have seen reports that during the conflict, Israel was actively, quote, activating, end quote, and even arming some of these clans that Hamas is now fighting and publicly executing.
Yeah, and the intent from the IDF was likely to create a local counterweight to Hamas that wanted to foster rivals that could challenge their authority on the ground. But it looks like what happened instead just contributed to the chaos of the power vacuum. So everything that the IDF did to try to defeat Hamas by arming these clans just added chaos to everything. I think it also may have given Hamas the perfect justification for its current crackdown. They can now frame their violence as a necessary campaign against Israeli-backed collaborators and criminals. That's a great messaging for Hamas towards the people of Gaza. It reinforces their narrative as the true guardians of order in Gaza.
It all seems to come back to what analysts have said is the most difficult part of this entire peace plan, which is the disarmament of Hamas. After all this, what does that even look like in practice?
Yeah, that's a multi-billion-dollar question. And the peace plan itself is incredibly vague on the details to this. So it's described more as a, quote, aspirational endpoint, end quote, than a concrete step-by-step process. Now, the most probable scenario is actually not a full disarmament.
So they will not be turning in all their guns.
Yeah, it's highly unlikely that that's going to happen. The pragmatic compromise, which may never be stated out loud, is likely a partial disarmament of Hamas. So Hamas would surrender its remaining stocks of heavier offensive weapons, the rockets and mortars that can target Israel. This would neutralize them as an external military threat. I think Israel can get behind that as long as Hamas is not a threat at distance with these weapons, these mortars and rockets. Netanyahu can claim victory for that. But look, Hamas is absolutely going to refuse to hand over their firearms, their lighter weapons, rifles and handguns. They need those to function as an internal security force. And as we're seeing now, they're going to use that to crush any opposition to their rule.
So Hamas gives up its ability to attack Israel, but in exchange, it solidifies its grip on power inside Gaza.
Yeah, I agree with that. That was the prevailing thought, but the situation here has become much more complex after a few days of the ceasefire. Look, we are now seeing reports of Hamas planning an internal purge of Palestinians. That was part of the Trump administration's warning that would have direct and grave violation of the ceasefire. They made it clear, the U.S. made it clear, such an action would undermine the significant progress that had been made. And this threat of internal conflict is a primary reason we've maintained on our end an unlikely assessment that the ceasefire is going to actually hold long term.
So, as we look ahead, what is the state of play in Gaza? It is not a state of war, but this does not sound like a state of peace either.
That's a state of deep instability. So you have a fragile truce being tested every single day. As we're talking right now, I'm getting reporting of Hamas fighters firing on IDF and IDF shooting rockets at Hamas sites in Gaza. Now, we've got to validate and verify all that information is true before we make any statements on that. But you can see how fragile this ceasefire is with two entities that just don't trust each other. So the other sort of fragility here is with the hostage issue, right? Is Israel going to receive all of those bodies? And then internally in Gaza, you have a brutal consolidation of power underway by Hamas in a completely devastated landscape. Then, not to be outdone, you've got the external effects. So you have a very wary United States trying to manage this crisis and prevent a relapse into all-out war, which is going to cost the United States even more. Washington has no appetite for another flare-up here in the Middle East, especially given the significant regional tensions that we're seeing elsewhere, like the recent friction with Venezuela that we'll get into. So containing the Gaza situation, even with this imperfect and violent outcome, that's going to be a major strategic priority. What we are witnessing is the violent, messy birth of Gaza's next chapter.
An uncertain future indeed. And that theme of instability is playing out across the globe. When we return from a short break, we'll shift our focus from the power vacuum in Gaza to the generational power shift in Madagascar, where a youth-led revolution has created its own volatile and uncertain future. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back, listeners. As we hinted at before the break, we are diving deep into a story that, frankly, has dominated the geopolitical headlines this week. And it really speaks to a trend we have been tracking for months now. We are talking about Madagascar, where a president has been forced to flee and a military unit has taken control. It is the latest government to be toppled in a crisis driven overwhelmingly by its own young people. The sheer speed of this entire collapse is stunning. So let's start with the bottom line. What does your analysis tell us about what is actually happening on the ground right now?
In simple terms, power has been transferred from a highly isolated, failed civilian government to a military junta. The commander of the elite CAPSAT unit has declared a takeover. and he has suspended nearly every key democratic institution, everything from the Senate to the Electoral Commission.
But he has kept the National Assembly, though. Is that a fig leaf, or is it a genuine attempt to maintain some minimal level of constitutional continuity?
Yeah, no, I heard the giggle there because you knew the answer to this. It's a fig leaf, right? So it's a calculated move for marginal legitimacy. And the military is fully in charge and has dissolved the bodies that could actually challenge their power, like the High Constitutional Court and the body responsible for holding elections. So from my own assessment, this new regime intends to rule for the full 2-year transition period that they asked for. And I do think that there is a possibility they will try to retain power for longer than those 2 years. They are now setting the rules.
Yeah, I saw an article where they came out and said, we promise it's just going to be a 2-year transitional period. That's it. We promise. I mean, that is a sobering assessment, especially considering the history of political instability in Madagascar and the fact that the previous president himself came to power in a coup in 2009. But we cannot talk about this without focusing on the engine that drove this change. And that was the youth-led Gen Z movement.
Yeah, and this is a critical factor. The protests started over basic human goods, much like we've seen in other locations where this happened. So they were protesting the lack of water, the lack of electricity, but it morphed into a mass movement against corruption and profound poverty. 75% of Madagascar lives in poverty, and the average age is under 20. This is a massive, highly frustrated youth bulge. They successfully exploited the government's economic failure and also the poor governance that was happening.
And they did it with a specific cultural flair, using that skull and crossbones banner that we have seen popping up in other protest movements across Asia. It highlights how connected this movement is globally.
Yeah, look, it is very connected. I think that's why I was thinking it was important to highlight what's happening in Madagascar. The youth generated the upheaval, but the military actually seized the opportunity. So if the military wants to retain power, it's going to likely have to co-opt the Gen Z demands for these reforms. They're going to need to fix some power cuts to buy themselves time, but they have a very low probability of implementing deep, long-term solutions needed to fix the poverty and corruption. I don't think the military here has the capacity or the political will to do any of this.
So, for the international community, what is at play here? We have already seen the African Union issue warnings. So, what is the diplomatic fallout assessment?
It's very straightforward. Sanctions and suspension from the African Union. The moment a military suspends key democratic institutions, they violate the African Union's anti-coup norms. They will be isolated. That's going to be terrible for their already struggling economy. The international response is crucial because it is the only leverage to push them toward a civilian transition. As of right now, the United States does not consider what is happening in Madagascar a coup, as the military only took control after the government ousted the president. So the military didn't oust the president, the government did that.
And speaking of transitions, we have been discussing the spread of this Gen Z dynamic, the catalyst of corruption and economic pain sparking youth-led political mobilization. We saw it in South Asia first, and now it is clearly spreading in Africa. So where else do we need to be watching in the context of this new protest dynamic?
Yeah, I think we have to look at countries with high youth rates, long-term economic struggles, and highly centralized or authoritarian governments. So I'm looking in North Africa, Morocco. That's a top concern. We're already seeing youth-led protests there against the backdrop of high youth unemployment, demanding better public services and an end to corruption. So the underlying conditions within Morocco are ripe for escalation, even though they have a strong monarchy right now.
And we also wanted to look at the other side of the world, specifically Latin America, where economic disparity is often severe. Are the conditions there right for a Gen Z-driven political crisis?
Yeah, they absolutely are, Tiana. Latin American countries like Peru are already seeing this happen. Protests over pension reforms quickly morphed into a wider anti-corruption and anti-insecurity movement led by young people. The common thread here is a frustration with political elites who are seen as living lavishly. We talked about this before, the Nepo kids concept, while the majority faces economic stagnation and a lack of opportunities. These Nepo kids are living the dream and showing that on social media channels like TikTok and Instagram. Now, this disparity is a key vulnerability. Any long-standing authoritarian regime that cannot deliver basic services in a country with a large, poor, and educated youth population, they should be on high alert.
So the conditions are global. Economic pain, political corruption, and a generation that is globally connected and has no tolerance for the failures of the previous generation's politics. So, looking forward to the next 6 months in Madagascar, what is the single biggest threat that we are watching for?
I think the biggest threat is that the current crisis is just phase one in this respect. It is possible we see a significant new political crisis or a counter coup in the next 12 months. This is within Madagascar. The military is not a single entity. Different factions have different goals. The initial joy of the protesters, and they were excited within Madagascar that all this came about, that could fade if we see the new military-led government not deliver those basic services. So if the lights still go out and the corruption remains, the energy of the Gen Z movement is simply going to redirect from the old president to the new colonel in power. This is not the end of Madagascar's instability. It is the beginning of a new chapter.
So, in Madagascar, we see a stunning example of a government's power being shattered from the inside by its own people. But that's not the only way established power is being challenged this week. We now turn to a very different kind of confrontation where the challenge comes from the outside, involving warships instead of street protests. In the Caribbean, the United States is escalating a direct military challenge to the Maduro regime in Venezuela, blurring the line between a war on drugs and a prelude to something much larger. What began as a pressure campaign has now evolved into a multifaceted operation involving overt military posturing, lethal strikes, and now the acknowledged use of clandestine services. So let's start with the most visible part of all of this, the military movements in the Caribbean. We are hearing about warships, a significant number of troops in the region, and even B-52 bombers flying off the Venezuelan coast. What is the strategic purpose of such a visible show of force?
It's classic coercive diplomacy. So the goal here is to signal serious intent and capability without initiating a full-scale conflict in the region. So deploying these assets is meant to create psychological pressure on the Maduro regime. It forces leadership to confront a credible threat on their doorstep every single day. The B-52 flights, specifically, those are a powerful message. It's B-52 bombers. And they didn't enter Venezuelan sovereign airspace, but they did operate within the country's what's called flight information region. And that's the international airspace in which Venezuelan air traffic control would be managing.
And it has not stopped at just a show of force. The United States has conducted multiple lethal strikes against boats in the area. The official justification is that these are drug-carrying vessels.
Yeah, and this is where the situation becomes legally and strategically complex. So the administration has reportedly reframed its approach. They're linking the Maduro government to drug trafficking organizations. And they're designating those groups as, quote, narco-terrorists, end quote. This creates the legal framework, at least from the U.S. perspective, to treat those individuals as enemy combatants. Now, this shifts the paradigm from a law enforcement issue, which would require arrests and trials, to a military one. The military one permits the use of lethal force under the laws of armed conflict.
And we are seeing UN-appointed experts label these strikes as extrajudicial executions, and it is having a regional impact, with Trinidad and Tobago investigating whether some of its own citizens, reportedly fishermen, being killed in one of these attacks.
Yeah, exactly. Once again, actions do not happen in a vacuum. Same here. While the administration may have its own internal legal justification, that view is clearly not shared by parts of the international community. So it creates diplomatic friction. This also feeds into the narrative that President Maduro is promoting domestically, which is Venezuela is under attack.
Which brings us to perhaps the most concerning development. President Trump has now publicly confirmed that he authorized the CIA to conduct covert operations inside Venezuela. It's extremely rare for a sitting president to acknowledge something like that so openly. So what does that signal to you?
I think it's a significant escalation. It shows a willingness to abandon ambiguity, which the CIA loves to work under. That's not a dig at the CIA. It's a clandestine intelligence agency. They want to work within ambiguity.
Yeah, that's their purpose.
Yeah, exactly. Publicly confirming a covert action, I think, serves two purposes here. One is that it amplifies the psychological pressure on Maduro, but not just President Maduro, also his inner circle, who I think feel more vulnerable than President Maduro. So that what it's saying is that the threat is no longer just external from these bombers and these ships that you can track on radar and from satellites, but it now becomes internal. It aims to create paranoia and mistrust within the regime. So think like the Mossad working in Iran and what that has done to the Iranian regime. Second, it sends a message to the American public and also international partners that this administration, the Trump administration, is taking what it deems to be decisive action. So in practical terms, this authorization could cover a wide spectrum of activities. Look, we're not talking about just assassinations here. CIA operations, they're more like textbooks than they are spy movies. So what is likely occurring here is intelligence gathering. They'll also see some propaganda as well as supporting opposition groups on the ground.
All right, so let's look at the other side. How is Nicolas Maduro responding to this immense pressure?
I think he's walking a fine line right now. On one hand, he's projecting strength for his domestic audience. He's got to do that. Mobilizing the military, mobilizing his civilian militias. They're conducting exercises, and they're using defiant rhetoric against what he calls U.S. aggression and imperialism. He's even passed a decree of, quote, external commotion, end quote. That's granting, that gives him sweeping powers within the government. Now, on the other hand, he's also appealing for peace on the international stage. We heard that he had offered all of the resources within Venezuela to the U.S., and he's speaking directly to the people of the United States. He's calling for dialogue here.
This strategy of applying maximum pressure with a combination of military and clandestine tools justified by a unique legal interpretation feels like a pattern. And in the middle of all of this, there is the human element. The most recent U.S. strike was different. There were survivors, 2 of them, who have now reportedly been captured and are being repatriated to their homeland. That changes things, does it not?
I think it changes things profoundly. It moves the conflict from the abstract realm of long-distance strikes to the concrete reality of what do you do with survivors during these strikes? Raises immediate and difficult legal questions about their status. Are they criminals? Are they enemy combatants? What rights do they have? So when we were we being the U.S. military and myself in Iraq and Afghanistan, when enemy combatants would survive a targeted strike, they would typically be scooped up by either the terror organization that they work for or the local populace and taken to a safe house. Now, on the off chance U.S. forces were within reach, those individuals be detained, they'd be held indefinitely for intelligence purposes. So the fact the U.S. is returning these individuals, I think that calls into question their association with the cartels.
It really does call into question their association with the cartels, because if they were criminals doing something that merited the United States going after them, why would they repatriate them to their home countries?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And from the U.S. perspective, what the Trump administration would say is, in good faith, we're returning these people back to their homeland so that they can stand trial, for the crimes that they committed in here. But you're absolutely right. And I always think back to that, within Iraq and Afghanistan, within Somalia, right? Targeted strikes by the U.S. on terrorists. Well, this is what the Trump administration is calling these drug peddlers, right? Narco terrorists. So they are terrorists. So if they were targeted in a strike like that as a terrorist, they should be deemed that way. And if you pick them up, you should hold them for intelligence purposes. I don't have a good answer for why they would actually repatriate them back to their homeland. Part of the reason may be because, we're dealing with our own things back in the United States with ICE, things that we don't get into on this podcast because I don't know that they're geopolitically relevant. But once they do become that, We'll talk about it. Bringing in people into the United States that the taxpayers would have to fund for their trial, for holding them within cells, may not be seen as something that the American people want to see happen. Maybe that's what the Trump administration is thinking here. So send them back to their homeland, and the people there can deal with them.
But they've already come out and said that those people are not, Venezuela has already come out and said that those people are not the criminals that they are being portrayed as. So why would they put them on trial if they don't think they're criminals? I don't know. That logic from the United States doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make sense to me at all.
It does, does the argument hold water, right? At this point, on the surface, it doesn't seem like it holds water. I'd have to look deeper into it. Now we know that you talked about it with Trinidad and Tobago, right? That they said that these were fishermen who were attacked, but also countries would not readily admit that, we had people that are doing drug running from our country to the United States. Think of and it's not a 1-for-1, apples to apples, but we talk about this with the CCP, with the Chinese Communist Party, right? If a war were to start with the Chinese Communist Party, we would definitely attack fishing vessels, because we in the United States and in the intelligence community understand those fishing vessels actually work for the CCP and the PLA, and the PLA, and so we would attack them. But China would say these are just fishermen. They have, they're not enemy combatants. They have no use in this war. You should not be attacking them. So while that's not apples to apples, you would not see a country, especially like Venezuela, say, these are drug dealers, and we'll take them back and we'll put them on trial. That would be pretty. That'd make them look pretty bad.
But also, if they were truly criminals, like you said, they would have been taken in for intel. So
I'm not arguing with you, T. You are exactly right. I'm definitely bringing the other perspective of it. But if you want to know my true opinion on it, that you just don't do that. You hold them, right, and you gain intelligence to track other narco terrorists, right, to infiltrate the cartel. So bad look to do that, I think, from the Trump administration, but that's just my opinion.
I think that is a fitting place to end, which perfectly captures our theme this week, shifting power. Whether it's the generational power shift in Madagascar, the brutal struggle to fill a power vacuum in Gaza, or the high-stakes diplomatic power plays over Ukraine, the old rules are fracturing. The nature of conflict itself is changing, and the questions are becoming more complex than the answers. We'll be watching to see how these new power dynamics continue to unfold, so stick with us each week as we continue to try to make sense of the world around us all. As we close out, Cribbin, is there anything else that you want to discuss?
I don't have anything. No. You got anything?
Yeah, I'm sure they're pleased to not have us jibber jabber for 20 minutes.
I don't know. We'll have to find out. We'll run a poll.
No. I don't want to know. Anyway, thank you for listening to This Week Explained. We hope that you found it both informative and engaging. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, we would love to hear from you. For more in-depth coverage of these stories and more, be sure to follow us on social media at This Week Explained.
Tiana, thank you so much. And until next week, stay safe out there.